Yeah, I'm here to talk to you about some of the work we've been involved with Weyerhaeuser. We actually started in 2006 working with Wendy and Weyerhaeuser on some of their forest management projects related to birds. And we took over some of this work from Roger Brown, actually. Fiona Schmiegel's husband had been working with them for a number of years. And they've been doing surveys in the foothills in Alberta since about 1998. Every 3 years they're going in and monitoring stations in the area for birds, both owls and songbirds. With the songbirds in particular for this presentation, they've been surveying around Grand Prairie since 2001, 506 stations every 3 years, and then in Pembina around Edson and Drayton Valley, Rocky Mountain House, 739 stations every 3 years since 1999. So we've been talking a lot about the MBCA, migratory birds, and particularly with the forest industry, they're really concerned with the Section 6, which really involves disturbance of nests and taking of the nests or eggs during habitat disturbance. But we have to keep in mind also when we were working along with Wendy about the provincial species that aren't covered federally, and we've been sort of keeping that in our minds while we're moving forward. And then, of course, there's the SARA-listed species of concern that are of particular interest population-wise when you're doing habitat disturbance to make sure that you manage for those. And again, it's this minimizing incidental take through mitigation and just showing due diligence that we're trying to do something to help protect nesting birds. So when we got involved, we talked with Environment Canada, and really these three things were sort of laid out, knowing our legal obligations as far as protecting birds, avoiding harvest during key sensitive times, and mitigation and prevention where possible. And as I mentioned, the provincial regulations are of concern too, and we got to keep these in mind. Doing my thesis on owls and then working with owls for the last 20 years, I know that they're also a species that, we have to keep, a group of birds that we have to keep in mind, and they are not protected federally, and so making sure we manage for those was of interest to me. So a bit of background about how all this stuff got started. Wendy asked us, beyond doing the bird surveys for the company, was to do some nest sweeps. So nest sweeps are kind of the key thing that a lot of companies need to do. Oil and gas was a big thing, and the province was asking oil companies to do nest sweeps from making sure to protect the nests. And we thought, well, we're going to be harvesting during the time of season when there's lots of birds nesting. Let's go out, find some nests, and make sure we manage for those and use that as part of the retention that's already being put out there, but put them around nests so we're actually directly protecting nests. And so this is the kind of work we did, just to give you an idea of some blocks that we've surveyed for them. Weyerhaeuser has a policy of all stick nests being protected with a 100-meter buffer, regardless of whether they're occupied or not. So to the somewhat dismay of some of the managers, we did find quite a few stick nests, and then of course they're clustered in areas. Usually goshawks and that will cluster their nests in areas, so you end up blocking out a lot of the habitat that could be harvested. But you can just see some of these are the lines that we do surveys on. There we walk within 20 meters of each other. We always work in pairs and really intensively survey, and these are all the circles around nests, 30-meter buffers for sort of common songbirds, and then 100-meter buffers around stick nests. You can see this one, particularly this block, they didn't get to harvest very much out of it. But really we're looking at directly protecting nests. But of course you don't find a lot of nests, and so we need to look beyond that. So in December, we were talking more about how else to manage for migratory birds. And so we looked at developing some guidelines around timing of harvest. So this was before all the Environment Canada guidelines were put on with the migratory bird. There's a nice website that they now have with all this vast amount of information, but this was before that time. And so we talked to Paul, and we got some guidance about when the key times might be for protecting nests. And so maybe trying to manage the forest around that and making sure that we try to move outside of those time periods. But again, it's difficult because harvesting does occur in the summertime as well. but trying to push, some of those out into the edges of the timing of when birds are nesting. From there, we started looking at risk assessments of where are the key places that birds are nesting, where are the most birds going to be found, in what type of forests, and then hopefully trying to protect those key areas. So mixed wood forests, for example, have very high risk, and so trying to protect that. But we needed to basically come up with a tool or a guide for forest managers to use. And so this was the task that Wendy put on me. And so I had to kind of think in my mind, how am I going to work on this? So we've been doing, as I mentioned, surveys for a number of years, so we had a lot of on-the-ground data to use to start looking at where most of the birds were found on the FMAs. So the idea was to determine the level of risk for incidental take for nesting birds in the various forest types. And then what we did is used common birds that were found. So based on our data, the most common species, there's high numbers of them using it. We also looked at the abundance, the richness, the number of species in each of those forest types. And then added to that, we also added listed species as a backup. And I'll talk a little bit about how we did that. As far as we also looked at the phenology, so we had to use literature in that. So again, the tables were not available on the web from Environment Canada for our guidance, but we wanted to key in on making sure that our time frames for when we recommended being outside those time zones would be the best time for doing the harvest. And then we looked at different forest types. So this is based on some of the data we analyzed, and so we divided out, pure stand was anything that had 80% or more, and I've got codes here, but lodgepole pine, mixed wood forests, and we just divided out to look at, first I looked at the density of birds, but it didn't really separate out enough, so I wanted to look at richness as well, and look at that diversity index, and it gave you a good range of different risks, so how many birds were in those different stands, different types of stands, and that way we could separate out which was going to be the highest risk. And as we found, which isn't a surprise, is that mixed wood forests have the highest risk for birds, both the richness and the abundance. Further to that, we also separated out the different regions of the FMA. So the FMAs sit in kind of a mixed wood area. There's lower foothills and upper foothills. So upper foothills have fewer birds, lower diversity, and so again, those might not be as much at risk for migratory birds. So again, they might fall at a lower level. And then we've also again included, oops. I skipped over there. So we also wanted to include priority species. So along this time, the BCR information came out, and we were able to use the list as priority species from Environment Canada, as well as species that are listed of concern. And these are just giving you some numbers of what we found in surveys we've done in the past, looking at how many were on the site. So should we consider those as part of the management? So Canada warbler, for example, in the Pembina, we've only ever found one on their FMA, and so really that wasn't something to consider when we're assessing the level of risk. But something like olive-side flycatcher would be, so we want to make sure that we include that in our designations. So we also started using the nesting zones information from Environment Canada, and we're in the B5 zone actually, so just more outside the main boreal. We're in the foothills in that area. And so these are the time frames that they recommend for protection of nests from Environment Canada. So basically trying to limit your harvest between April 22nd to August 24th. And so the first stab at this was just developing a key that I basically used like a dichotomous key, and this worked well at the beginning. So basically saying, the forester would go in and say, okay, it's pure lodgepole pine, okay, it's probably a medium risk for birds. If it's not lodgepole pine, you go into whether it's lodgepole pine deciduous and go on, so basically like a key, and you go through and then see what your level of risk is, and then decide whether if it's at extreme risk, you might want to move it outside the harvest season. If it's a medium risk, well, maybe it's go ahead and do it, or have best management practices for some of the higher risk stands. Following that, in the last year, they were asking, the operators and forest managers were asking for more detailed, so actually separating out by percent on what types of forests are, so being able to say, okay, it's got this much aspen, this much spruce, this much, so we actually came down into like a 1,400 lines of risk ratings, so each type of forest would be designated. So basically, if it's a 10% pine, I've got an example here, let's see, like 7% white birch and 2% pine, and so then the risk rating would be high. So it's actually by percentage of species on the ground, so it's much more detailed. And so this is what they've been using. And then further to that, we developed a actual GIS tool. So basically they would print out the areas they were harvesting in, and then it lays out where the areas are the highest risk for birds, and do best management practices for those higher end ones, and then maybe operation go ahead for some of the low risk stands. And so these are some of the risk ratings that we've developed, and then some of the, if anything's high risk or very high risk, we do nest sweeps, and then also owl surveys in the springtime. And if it's an extreme risk, they basically move that right outside the breeding season now. As far as owl surveys go, again, this was an idea to capture the owls, which are only covered under provincial jurisdiction, so making sure that there are no owls in there when they're harvesting early in the springtime, because they're actually earlier than the time frame the migratory birds are there, and that's their key breeding season. So we go in, survey, if we find owls, we walk in, determine whether they're nesting, and if it's a pair that looks like they may occupy a nest, we can designate some area for them to maintain. So we've been running this since 2014, and it's been going well. But again, we wanted to also bring it to some of the other forest industry partners, and so last year we went to BC, and first we met with Weyerhaeuser BC folks and Tolko, Gorman, and discussed developing a tool similar to this for their operations, and we developed a draft for them in August. And then we decided to try to invite other partners to try to increase the, the group that would be involved with this. And so now it's become an Interior BC program, and Mark did speak nicely to all the work that we've been doing there. And then that's been implemented as of April this year. So again, Mark mentioned a little bit about this program. So again, it's a risk rating system where again you're using bioclimatic zone and the age class and the height classes to designate how important these different forest types are to birds and their breeding. And then there comes with a nice best management practices tool, so if you are going to be operating during the harvest breeding bird season, to make sure that you can protect the birds with some best management practices. And then from there, as we have been talking about a lot, and Darren did mention this again, is testing those tools. So we've got these tools, they're being implemented, but we need data to actually test to make sure these things work. And as such, I just wanted to mention all the different groups that are involved for the BC Interior, all the different companies that have participated. So from there, we ended up doing some on-the-ground field work. So Mark's been working with BAM, and they have a lot of data, but some of the areas where Weyerhaeuser is located, and Tolko and Louisiana Pacific, there's not as much bird data for density estimates or abundance estimates. So we wanted to test to see whether these risk ratings were correct based on on-the-ground data. So we went out and started collecting on-the-ground data this spring. We did 166, I'm just going to present the Weyerhaeuser information because we haven't finalized all the Tolko or Louisiana Pacific yet. So we completed 166 point counts in the first year. And we have them in different sites for extreme, 6 very high, 11 high, 7 moderate, 5 low, and 1 very low risk. And this is the first look. I don't know if anybody's seen any of this data. Is that okay, Wendy? So this is some of the results that we had, and it actually showed quite nicely that basically the higher risk, the higher number of birds that we detected. And just shows a nice graph here showing the lower risk with the lower number of birds. But then there's some areas that we started getting a little bit of noise here. I mean, you can sort of see a general pattern of and then you've got some of these ones. And again, this is based on solely density. It's not based on any species at risk, and it's not based on species richness. So this site in particular, I went back and looked at, and actually there was a flock of birds, a flock of red crossbills that flew through the site and were detected, but may not have actually been like breeding right on that site. So that would increase the numbers. So we've got to start looking more into that. As well, with some of these lower numbers, again, we have to start investigating what exactly the force type is. So this is a grouping of anything rated risk 6, but there could be different force types associated with that. So now we've got to start investigating what specifically that force type is and why is it rating lower than some of the others. And species richness really does not give a good indication of risk. And that, I mean, we understand that when you get a lower site, it may have a diversity of different, like a younger site, for example, might have a whole bunch of different species there, but maybe low numbers of that species. So it's not a good indication of the risk of the site. So really that density and possibly Shannon index is probably the best. And so now bringing it back to Alberta, so we've been working on that. We're testing that tool, and now we've moved back to Alberta, and I'm working with Laura and other folks in Alberta to develop this tool to go right across the boreal. And Laura's been taking the lead on the bird group, and we've been developed a risk matrix similar to the one that we developed for BC. But in this case, we're developing it based on leading species, timber supply, or timber productivity ranking, and age class. And again, this is information that's available for AVI and available to most companies. Again, we'd love to go more detailed, like look at the understory vegetation and that, but we just really can't because it's the data for what we have. And again, this idea of having LiDAR, that more detailed information, will hopefully be the next step. So again, we've divided by natural subregions and then by leading species, and then using age classes and timber productivity ratings. And as you can see, it's blank. So I think we're having a meeting on Monday here with the group, and we're hopefully going to get somebody to start filling in this. And again, it'll be information based on what we know, and then we're looking at testing it after that. So again, just to summarize, we'll be filling in those risk ratings, but we'd like to do some validation again, similar to what we're doing in BC. And it's a growth and learning. We have to, always improve, keep improving every year. Waterfowl is not included, which probably leads into the next talk we're going to be hearing, because waterfowl has not been included in here. So and that's of concern because there's a lot of species that do nest in the forest and use cavities like goldeneye and bufflehead. And then what are about species not covered under MBCA? So these provincial-wide projects, they are only focused on songbirds and species that are listed. So these owls, again, which I'd like to put a plug for, that's of concern, and having that early season time frame and having a risk matrix basically set up for owls maybe, or including them in the risk matrix, and then making sure we have best management practices for them. And of course, those listed species do need to be an overlay for looking at managing populations as a whole. Species of concern, you can kill a few of them and it's going to cause a lot of problems. So you want to be managing those at a higher risk. So making sure that that's an overlay when you're actually using you may have a low risk stand, but if it has Canada warblers, well, all of a sudden it should be high risk stand. So making sure that you know where your species at risk are and what habitats you're using. And with that, I'll take any questions.